Welcome to the GPFans Podcast, your pit stop after every race, bringing you the latest news, gossip and drama from the 2019 Formula One season.
Mercedes continued their impressive start to 2019 with another 1-2 finish, this time on the challenging streets of Baku in Azerbaijan. It was a day to remember for Valtteri Bottas, who regained the championship lead with a win, but not a great day for Ferrari and their strategy team. We'll be talking through all the action from Baku, plus we'll be remembering Ayrton Senna on the 25th anniversary of his death.
The GPFans Podcast.
My name is Rob Watts. This is the GPFans F1 Podcast. Joining me this week will be GPFans editor Matt Scott. But you might be thinking, where's the guy who normally does it? The one who sounds like he knows what he's doing. Well, unfortunately, our usual host, Harry Benjamin, cannot be with us this week. So I'll be stepping into his massive size 16 shoes. And yes, they really are that big. So please do bear with me, as hosting is not my usual gig. So without further ado, let's get on with the show and discuss the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. So Matt, it was a record-breaking result for the Mercedes team. Tell us why.
Yeah, 4 1-2s in a row. I think the record is aided slightly by the Indy 500 being in the calendar in some of the 50s. I think I've seen some pedants. There's a few seasons where there have been similarly dominant starts in the races where all the same cars were on the grid, if that makes sense. But certainly in the modern era, we've never really seen anything like it. I think it's striking that Mercedes have never done this before. Red Bull never did this in Vettel's dominant years. Ferrari didn't do it in the early 2000s. It shows you that, I mean, this is a absolutely phenomenal achievement by Mercedes. Whatever anyone wants to say about how it's come about maybe this year with Ferrari not being at their best, the fact that Mercedes have either put together a better performance or been in the position to capitalise just shows how good that team is. I said a couple of weeks ago, maybe even on the last episode, they've forgotten how to lose. They've forgotten how not to win, Mercedes, and that was just in evidence again all through the Baku weekend, I think.
Yeah, it's a remarkable achievement for Mercedes, and obviously it's really ominous form for them. 4 races in, 4 1-2 finishes, but would it be fair to say that those 4 1-2 finishes have maybe flattered Mercedes a little bit? Have we seen the true Ferrari yet? Have we actually really seen what this Ferrari car is capable of?
Yeah, I think we could certainly say that some of this has been down to, like I said, Ferrari haven't maximised any weekend so far. I don't think, have they? I mean, we know, or we think that they've got the fastest car certainly in a straight line, and that should have been to their great advantage this weekend with the longest straight on the calendar. But just particularly strategically, I mean, we'll probably come on to this in a bit more detail later, but strategically, Mercedes have absolutely held the wood over them this year, from qualifying strategy and in race strategy as well. Ferrari's has left quite a lot to be desired. I think this weekend in Baku, they flip-flop between being too adventurous in qualifying and then not at all adventurous in the race, and just finding that happy medium is probably going to be key for Ferrari moving forward and for us as F1 fans moving forward, because if this season carries on like this, people are going to lose interest. I mean, we're not going to lose interest because we have a professional interest in F1, but people are going to lose interest in it if Mercedes are winning, not just winning every week, but winning with a 1-2 every week. It's absolutely crazy.
Well, one man who won't be losing interest is Valtteri Bottas. He's regained the lead of the championship from teammate Lewis Hamilton. The pair are tied on wins, but the extra point that Bottas claimed in Melbourne for getting the fastest lap has edged him ahead. This does really seem to be a new Valtteri Bottas this year. He looks to have shaken off the confidence issues he had in the second half of last season, and it doesn't look like being great news for Esteban Ocon.
No, I don't think anything other than a complete disaster for Bottas would have been good news for Ocon in terms of the Mercedes drive. I don't know if he really would have been a candidate for that next year. I think Bottas was probably always going to stay. Lewis Hamilton holds a lot of sway in that team, and Hamilton really likes him as a teammate. Even seemingly when he's getting beaten by him, it's remarkable how sort of magnanimous Hamilton is when he's been beaten by Bottas, and it was to the fore again this weekend. He was very praised Bottas a lot after qualifying. Hamilton not used to getting beaten on Saturdays, of course, and then after the race, just said Bottas has done a better job. He has so far this year in Baku. Well, Baku last year, we look back to obviously that sort of slightly heartbreaking puncture quite near to the end. If he'd won that race, he would have led the championship then as well. So it would suggest that we've been at some races that he enjoys, tracks that suit him. And in the last 2 seasons at Mercedes, where Hamilton has got the better of him, is the period that's coming up now. These European races where Hamilton really comes alive, and maybe they're races that don't suit Bottas's style quite so much for whatever reason. So, if in another 4, say we get to Silverstone and we're still in this situation, then yeah, we're definitely looking at a Bottas 2.0, and he's definitely a title challenger. As it is, I think it's kind of, I think we're kind of almost as expected. Again, looking at Hamilton, this is kind of his MO now, isn't it? He starts off not badly. He's won 2 races. He's not had a bad start to the season, but he steps it up as the season goes on, and Bottas hasn't shown he can do that in the past.
I think what we've seen in previous seasons, Bottas needs to capitalise on this strong start now, and he needs to make sure he's still in the fight until, like you say, the middle part of the season. We know he had some bad luck last year at the start, but the fact that he was so far behind by the midpoint of the season, it made it difficult for Mercedes not to back Hamilton. So I think he needs to stay close, whether he's leading the championship or not. I think he needs to stay close to Hamilton. And let's not forget, we might not yet have seen the best of Ferrari. They could still end up as contenders in this championship.
Definitely not. I mean, this race was one that they looked on it on Friday and Saturday, right up until Q2, and particularly Leclerc looked on it. His previous record at Baku's pretty special. He won both races there in Formula 2 in 2017, shortly after the death of his father as well. And last year it was his first points finish for Sauber. He finished 6th, I think, and that was before Sauber had kind of developed their car into the sort of midfield contender that it became. So it's clearly a track that suits him really well, probably better than any track on the calendar by the looks of it. And yeah, he just completely threw it away. I disagree slightly with Nico Rosberg, for example, who said that Ferrari threw it away. And you look at Leclerc's reaction, he was almost self-flagellating. He was furious with himself, and rightly so, because that race was, after Bahrain was taken out of his hands by Ferrari, I think this, he dropped this rather than it being taken away from him. Just not bailing out of the corner, basically. That was the mistake. I think in that, it might have even been in that Q2, Hamilton had a similar sort of lock-up going into the corner, and there's a tiny little bit of runoff just to the right of that first turn into that ridiculously tight castle complex. Hamilton bailed out, carried on, banked good points for Mercedes, and Leclerc didn't try to go through with the corner. It was never going to happen, and he paid the price.
Yeah, we had a couple of interesting comments on social media about Leclerc's accident. Carl Davey said, okay, so the only real fault is the tyre choice. He knew it was the medium tyre and the grip would be iffy, and he chose not to bail. as you mentioned there, Matt, maybe he would have been better off being a bit more conservative and maybe bailing out of that corner entirely. Peter Simonetti said he misjudged the turn, could happen to anyone. He's also putting unnecessary pressure on himself. He shows great potential, but just needs to calm down. One thing I found interesting was Leclerc's radio message after the crash. He said, I'm stupid. He seemed to be being really, really hard on himself. And I think, he needs to be careful about doing that, especially publicly, because he's only young, and I think that just increases the focus and the pressure on himself. Because let's not forget, we've seen drivers considerably more experienced than Charles Leclerc making errors worse than that in recent seasons.
Yeah, I guess it kind of comes down to experience as well. Lewis Hamilton I think it was the press conference after qualifying, he was sort of saying how he could understand how Leclerc felt. You look at Hamilton's early career. I think we might have talked about China 2007 after that race maybe. That was a massive error that cost him the championship basically. So these things happen at this stage of a driver's career, I guess, and it'll be a big test of Mattia Binotto, who he's not, I guess, had the best of starts as team principal or technical director, because the management of the team hasn't been great so far, and the car isn't or the drivers aren't able to get the maximum out of the car. So he, on multiple fronts, Binotto has got a bit of a job on his hands here.
Well, there's always pressure. It doesn't seem to matter who's in charge at Ferrari, and it certainly isn't a job that I would want. But do we think that Ferrari really blew the chance to win that race, or were they never really in with a realistic shout? Ferrari seemed to keep Leclerc out for far too long, and that obviously didn't pay off in the end, despite him leading at one point. But were Mercedes just too strong on the day?
I think there's every chance that if Ferrari had been a bit more ambitious with Leclerc, the kind of end result would have been the same anyway. But there was a point in the race where they could have pitted Leclerc for fresh, soft tyres, and he would have come out a second behind Vettel and 8 to 10 seconds behind Bottas and Hamilton, I think. He could have had a go, and he could have got past them again, and he would have had to stop again. We're talking 30 laps on tyres that wouldn't have lasted that long. So it would have been an aggressive strategy, but it might have forced Mercedes into doing something else. It would have put pressure back on Mercedes, and as it was, they ended up overtaking Bottas. Hamilton ended up overtaking Leclerc again. They got a bit of DRS, which took them further away from Vettel when Vettel was on a little charge. And it was just like it was a meh strategy. It's the only thing that I can sum it up with. It was just sort of, and Leclerc said afterwards, he was sort of asking about what's the strategy, and Ferrari just told him, no, there's nothing we can do. So you just sort of have to like it or lump it. And I don't know, it almost felt it felt like a punishment almost, maybe. I'm sure that wasn't the intention, but that's almost how it came across. It was like, well, you made the mistake in qualifying, now you've got to pay for it, rather than, kind of a team game. Which in a way, that sort of instinctively feels quite Ferrari-ish. The sort of the harmony isn't always there in that team, is it? And maybe we saw that again.
Yeah, one of the interesting comments I saw on social media came from Steve Miller, who said, Ferrari finding new inventive ways to balls everything up on a consistent basis seems to generate quite a bit of entertainment. Some of us remember 2011 and 2013. I guess it's been a running story in previous seasons. We've seen Ferrari have blown their chance to win races through poor strategy calls on a number of occasions, and I guess we'll never know if this was one of them, but it does look at least that the Mercedes pit wall had the upper hand this time.
Yeah, definitely. And like we mentioned before, even from qualifying, Mercedes going out at the start of Q3 and tricking Vettel into running without a toe at the end of Q3, sorry. And that was crucial. Vettel said afterwards, if I'd have had a tow, I would have had, maybe the extra time to qualify on pole or qualify on the front row, and the race would have been completely different. The sort of radio messages of that were quite fascinating. If you go back and hear them, the Ferrari team saying over the radio, "Do you want to go out now in clean air?" and Vettel saying on the radio, "No, I need the tow." And then while at the same time on the Mercedes team radio that Bottas and Hamilton are told, "Right, we're gonna sell them the dummy," and they went for it hook, line and sinker, and the race, well, probably wasn't ruined. Maybe there was something that could have been done from there. Like you say, it's difficult to know, but just this grip that Mercedes have got over Ferrari at the moment, it's almost like they're not on a level playing field. It's not unfair on Ferrari, but it's almost unfair on the viewers, because it just doesn't feel like a fair fight. You give Ferrari a faster car and Mercedes can still find a way to mess with them and stuff like that. So it's kind of a sign of, Ferrari failing, but like we said at the top, Mercedes are just absolutely supreme.
So as we've said, it's been the perfect start to the season for Mercedes, and if Ferrari, I should say, are going to force their way back into this championship, then they really do need to start winning fairly soon. That's it for part one, but in part two we're going to move a little bit further down the grid and focus on the midfield. There's a few interesting stories that emerged from there, and we'll also be looking at one particular driver who's had a weekend we're pretty sure that he'll want to forget.
The GPFans Podcast.
So it was a particularly bad weekend for Pierre Gasly in Baku, certainly one he'll be keen to move on from. He came into the weekend under a bit of pressure already, having failed to get to grips with his Red Bull in the first few races of the season. He had to take a grid penalty for a gearbox change and was then forced to start from the pit lane for failing to go to the weighbridge after FP2, and then he was excluded from qualifying altogether for a fuel flow issue. Really couldn't have got much worse, but then in the race, while recovering through the field, he was forced to retire with a broken drive shaft. He has less than a third of the points of teammate Max Verstappen after 4 races, and I think we can both agree that things just aren't working out for him right now.
Well, he's struggling, like you say. I mean, 3 pit lane starts in the end, because then on Sunday morning, after the gearbox change, there was another irregularity with that. So, if they'd have all been put back to back, he might have been starting the race in Turkey or something like that. It was absolutely. I don't think I've ever seen that before. Someone given 3 pit lane starts for 3 separate incidents over one race weekend. I think there was I don't know what you think about this, Rob, but there was a bit of a debate on Friday into Saturday when he was given his first pit lane start. So this was for missing a call to the weighbridge right at the end of FP2. There's like a display as the drivers go in, and his name and number was there, and I think Christian Horner was explaining, Gasly missed it, and his race engineer, who would have had a kind of notification about it, he missed it because they were doing a pit stop practice. So he was concentrating on that. It seems draconian is the word that Horner used. For something on a Friday in FP2, for then that, and it's not. Gasly wasn't found, his car wasn't underway, he didn't brake, his car wasn't breaking any rules at that point. It was a seemingly an honest mistake, and for him to then have to start from the pit lane, it rendered his qualifying pointless, and affected his race as well. I mean, what do you reckon about that? It seems harsh to me.
I would agree on that. It did seem a little harsh. To effectively have your entire weekend compromised, if not ruined, is harsh for an infringement like that in practice. I'm not really sure what you could do, perhaps a fine, but as we've seen, a 5 or 10k fine for a team like Red Bull is just small change, really. But yeah, the penalty was harsh. I definitely agree on that.
Yeah, and then, like we were saying, his race then from there was impacted. He did okay, I guess, to get through the field. You would expect him to, but he got to the point where he should get to, and that is the crumb of positivity that I think Gasly can probably take from this weekend. That he's qualified out of position in Australia and Bahrain, and he didn't make it back to the top six. Which you look at last year, those guys, if they were ever out of position, they always made it very comfortably back to the top six. So at least he did that. But then, I don't know, maybe he pushed the car a bit too much, and ends in a failure. And he probably just needs something, doesn't he? And he probably needs it quite quick. Otherwise, we know what Red Bull's like. I think he'll probably see out the season, but will he come back for 2020 if this season carries on? You wouldn't think so.
Well, it's never easy for any driver coming into the Red Bull team. We've seen in the past only too well with Danny Kvyat, but one driver who's recently left the Red Bull team, in fact, the driver that Pierre Gasly replaced, he's not having a very good time with his new team. Daniel Ricciardo, he has had a very tricky start to the season, and he definitely had a weekend forget in Baku.
Yeah, I mean, have you ever seen a more sort of pathetic retirement in all of your F1 watching life? Just not looking in his mirrors and reversing into Kvyat after locking up and forcing them both into that little runoff area. It wasn't a great weekend for Renault in general. I think it was under braking. I mean, there's a lot of these sort of slow speed 90-degree corners in Baku, so it is, I guess, you put the brakes through a lot of work. Both him and Hulkenberg was absolutely nowhere. He's sort of out in Q1 and finished, I think, 14th. So they were having a lot of problems all through the weekend. And Ricciardo, I think he was on for a low points finish possibly when he retired. So similar to Gasly, there was a silver lining, but the cloud is growing ever bigger, and that's probably the issue for Ricciardo. As this goes on and on and on, he's probably gonna start getting more questions. Does he think it was the right decision? I'm sure when he made the move, he was expecting, I think we've said this probably after pretty much every race this year, because he's not had a good season. He was probably expecting some difficulties, but was he expecting it to be this difficult? Surely not.
Well, Daniel said as much during pre-season that he didn't expect to be winning races this year, but I think after four races now into his Renault career, I think he'll be slightly concerned by the fact that he's retired from 3 of them, even if Baku probably was his own doing. Because Nico Hulkenberg, his teammate, has also retired from 3 of the 4 races. Between them, they've only got 12 points. It's not really, I would imagine, what he had in mind.
Yeah, I mean, those sort of expectations were coming from Cyril Abiteboul as well. He was saying, our aim this year is to kind of leave the midfield behind and maybe close the gap to the top 3, which is very McLaren-ish in its failure to materialise so far. I wonder if he might be under a bit of pressure. There's a lot of issues at Renault as the wider company at the moment. Obviously, the boss is in legal trouble. Let's just, I guess, leave it there. And Carlos Ghosn, he was the guy who kind of pushed for the return of the F1 team as well. So if he's in trouble and then the F1 team isn't doing very well, where does that leave the F1 team? Maybe we might see them out of F1 in the not too distant future.
Absolutely, there's always a risk of that. If a big manufacturer doesn't get the results that they want over a prolonged period of time, we've seen it happen in the past when a big car manufacturer has just pulled the plug on F1. But if we look at the team that Renault is supplying power units to, McLaren, they seem to be heading in the right direction now. And it seems to be that things are a little bit more harmonious there than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, big time. I mean, like we were saying about how Renault's promises and stuff, that this was what McLaren were doing last year. They were saying we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and this year their results aren't that much better than they were at this time last season. I think Alonso was in the points in the first 5 races last year, so maybe their results aren't better, but just the context that they come in is much better. You know, McLaren have said, well, we'll see what happens, and for them to be fourth with a rookie driver and a new driver to the team who've both done really well, particularly in qualifying. You know, things obviously haven't happened in races for Carlos Sainz, but he kind of put it all together this weekend, which was pretty impressive. It's nice to see this new humble McLaren. You know, after several years of promising big and getting it wrong. You know, it's worth remembering that they are one of the biggest teams in F1 history, but this kind of, seeing them not act like it is quite nice. It's quite refreshing.
I think one of the things that went against McLaren, especially during the Honda years, was the lack of humility that they showed. Especially when talking up their chassis and suggesting they'd be winning races with a better power unit. But one of the other teams that have fallen, quite far down the grid, Williams, they have remained humble. But my goodness, they are struggling at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, what did Claire Williams say? It doesn't rain, it doesn't pour, it thunders, or something like that. They are, of all the teams on the grid that this weekend you would not want to happen to, it would be Williams. Obviously George Russell sucking a drain cover off the track in FP1. That was it's not something that you never see, but you quite rarely see it. That for Williams, this was the race that they've brought their first spare chassis to this year, I think, or something like that. So it just goes to show how on a knife edge their fortunes have been. And then Kubica, same place as Leclerc, obviously, in the qualifying session before Leclerc, also bins it into the wall. His car needed a rebuild. I would imagine that puts some serious strain on Williams' resources across the weekend.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw this, but when George Russell's car was being recovered after hitting the drain cover, the pickup truck hit the bridge,
yeah.
And I think it was oil or something, and then spilt all over the car. So, I mean, it was quite comical, but I'm sure the guys at Williams aren't laughing, because it just seems to be one thing after another at the moment. It's never ending for them.
It's just really sad, isn't it? And like you say, that image of this truck that nobody had realised was taller than the bridge midway around the circuit, and it was a proper bang as well, an almighty crack, like you say, leaked whatever it was all over the car. And yeah, it was a perfect image for their season so far, isn't it? If it can go wrong, it will go wrong. Unfortunately
so, and things just don't seem to be heading in the right direction at the moment. There doesn't seem to be a lot of progress being made. I know it's early in the season, but we spoke in a previous episode about Patrick Head coming back to the team. But is there really anything that they can do now, or do you think they're just going to write off this season?
Yeah, I think in the first, after Australia, we were talking about it there, where this is what they did last year. They sort of they turned up at the start of the season, realised that their car wasn't good enough, and so they gave up on it and started work on this year's car quite early, I think. I guess that work will have been impacted by the sort of turnover of staff that they had at Williams last year. So maybe if they switch focus to 2020 quite early, maybe with a stable technical team in place, they might be able to do something together there. But I guess, as I say, that they haven't got a stable technical team in place, have they? Because their technical director is on leave. So yeah, it's not looking good. I mean, there was a bit of talk before the coming into the Baku weekend of a takeover from Dmitry Mazepin, who is the father of Formula 2 racer Nikita Mazepin. He tried to buy Force India last year as well, and I think he's still in legal proceedings with the administrators for why that went to Lawrence Stroll and not him. So, maybe when that clears up, Mazepin can maybe look at Williams, and it's kind of sad that that's probably what it's come down to. But that probably is what Williams need now, isn't it? They just need a sack of cash to employ more people, maybe improve their facilities a bit more. Otherwise, how do they ever get out of this spiral? Because they've gone steadily down the championship standings since since they had that good start to the hybrid era thanks to the Mercedes engine. But yeah, how would they improve now? It's actually quite difficult to kind of see it happening, isn't it?
It is sad, because I think anyone around our age or older will remember and probably have quite fond memories of Williams winning races and championships and the drivers that they had. And, the situation they find themselves at the moment, if they can't turn this around and they end up having to sell up or they go out of business, it's going to be such a huge loss for Formula One, because, they're one of the original independents, and they're a proper racing team.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, like you say, Williams are kind of the essence of F1, aren't they? They're a racing team. They're not a commercial arm for a soft drink company or a promotional tool for a car manufacturer. Their sole purpose on this planet is to race. Like you say, to lose that from the grid would be pretty terrible.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that. That's it for part 2. Coming up in part 3, we're going to be looking back on Ayrton Senna, who tragically lost his life 25 years ago at the 94 San Marino Grand Prix. We're going to be looking back on some memorable moments from his career and discussing his impact on Formula One. So that's coming up next.
The GPFans Podcast.
So you won't have missed this if you've been active on social media over the last few days. We've been quite sadly looking back on the sad passing of Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna in that tragic weekend at Imola 25 years ago. For Ayrton especially, it's really difficult to put into words the impact that he had on Formula One and the legacy he left behind.
Yeah, both of us not quite old enough to have, we didn't live through kind of Senna's glory era, if you like, as F1 fans. It was completely before my time. Certainly, I don't think I will have even ever watched a race with Senna in. But once you become an F1 fan, you very early on, you're made aware of who Senna is, what he means to F1, and you go back and I've watched so many Senna moments, that you certainly have an understanding at least of just how good he was. That's the thing that's what endures as his legacy, isn't it? He was by far and away the best driver probably of his generation. Even still to this day, arguably of any generation, it's difficult to compare across eras. The things that he did at that time, you think about having a teammate like Alain Prost and some of the sort of beatings on track that he gave Prost, just served to kind of underline the incredible skill and talent that he had.
It's been well documented, the rivalry that Ayrton Senna had with Alain Prost, and if you've seen the Senna film, you'll know all too well about how heated that got. But if we look back on the time when Ayrton Senna was racing and when he was at his peak, he had some really tough competitors. He had the likes of Piquet and Mansell as well, not to mention Alain Prost as a teammate. So it actually really makes his record and the statistics that he ended his career with all the more impressive.
Yeah, pole position particularly, obviously Lewis Hamilton has that now and Schumacher took it from Senna, but Senna's record stood for many, many years after his death, and you think that he didn't complete his career like Schumacher did, and obviously hopefully Hamilton will as well. For him to have put that record together in a shortened career and for it to have stood for so long, he's still third all time on that list. And we've seen dominant teams come and go. We've seen multiple world champions. You think of Hakkinen, Alonso. Vettel seemingly qualified on pole and won every week when he was at Red Bull, and he still hasn't accumulated as many pole wins as Senna did. So that, yeah, I mean, like you say, it just goes to show how good he was, particularly at that specific skill.
Yeah, I mean, Ayrton Senna's single lap pace was almost legendary. 65 pole positions was a remarkable achievement. And it took Michael Schumacher 12 years of competing to actually beat that. And what was interesting as well is the racetrack he actually did it at was Imola, the circuit where Senna tragically lost his life. So, I mean, that was quite a bizarre circumstance to happen. But yeah, Senna was, I would say, widely regarded as one of, if not the greatest qualifier of all time. You only have to look at his pole lap at Monaco in 1988, a second and a half quicker than Alain Prost, who himself was a 4-time world champion by the end of his career. So, I mean, you just would never see that today. It's unfathomable to imagine a second and a half advantage over your teammate around Monaco.
Yeah, Monaco 1988. I mean, two bizarre things about that. The lap wasn't televised. Can you imagine that in the modern day and age? I think McLaren had to reimagine it using the video game a couple of years ago. It's one of the most legendary moments in F1 history, and you can't watch it. You had to be there at the time, which part of me kind of likes that. There's I think you look back at quite a lot of different sports, there are previously elements of you had to be there to see it, which is kind of quite nice. It almost makes it more special in a way. The other crazy thing about that famous lap is that he then didn't win. He was 50 seconds ahead of Prost, in his own words, having an out-of-body experience, being told by Ron Dennis to slow down, and he crashed. He sort of seemingly out of nowhere, he crashed out of the race and walked straight home to his apartment, where I think the story goes he was just found crying. He was just sat in his Monaco apartment crying, which kind of speaks to that, and the out of body experience, I think, as well speaks to the emotional character that he was. As much as he was a a brilliant racing driver, he wasn't necessarily this sort of cold, calculated robot on track, was he? Has there ever been a more emotionally led driver than Senna? Probably not, which various controversies down the years, particularly with Prost, probably explains quite a lot of them, and certainly I would say explains that particular moment in Monaco.
Yeah, we had some really interesting comments on Ayrton Senna on Facebook. John Hersom says Senna was more than fast. He had a charisma that saturated the entire F1 weekend. When you saw that yellow helmet go by just above the barriers, it was magic. I've only been to one F1 race since. It's not the same. Matthew Hawkins said, if you look at Williams' success in the mid-90s, he could have possibly gone on to win a few more titles, that is. A career cut short, but no doubt he's right up there. But Steve Miller had a slightly different view. He said he's probably the most naturally gifted ever. Jim Clark, that is a legitimate contender for that. But as an all-round package, for all his flaws, Michael Schumacher is the greatest driver. So that's an interesting one there, the debate between who was better, Senna or Schumacher.
Well, I guess statistically, you can't really argue with that. That middle point is really interesting about what would he have gone on to achieve with Williams had he obviously not had the accident. Just things like you look at, he was on a run of 5 consecutive wins at Monaco, which is to this day a record. No one's won one race in consecutive years as many times as that. I think Hamilton could have matched it at a couple last year and didn't do it actually. So that's going to stand for at least however many more years. I don't know what the longest current run on the grid is at the moment. It's probably Hamilton somewhere, isn't it? But yeah, you look at what Williams went on to do that year, 1994. Damon Hill pushed Schumacher all the way for the title. You know, the controversy in Adelaide and stuff like that. You would imagine that Senna would have actually been the number one driver. You know, he would have been the one in the championship fight. He was the one with the title experience compared to Schumacher at that time. Williams won a couple more championships not long after that. So who knows? You know, it's kind of like, it's almost like the butterfly effect, isn't it? You know, maybe we wouldn't talk about Michael Schumacher like we talk about him today. Maybe, you know, Jacques Villeneuve would have never raced in F1. Maybe Damon Hill would have never won that emotional world title. You know, it's kind of fascinating to think about how different F1 would look if Senna had, well, if he was still here, or if that incident hadn't happened.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think what might have happened had Senna not passed away. And I think one of the things that people feel slightly robbed of is the potential for that Senna-Schumacher rivalry, which I think could have been just as spicy as the Senna-Prost rivalry that we obviously we got to see play out. I read a book recently called Senna versus Schumacher, and you should Google that and check it out, because it's really interesting. It looks at how things might have changed, how the course of F1 might have gone in a different direction, particularly for some notable drivers, had Senna not passed away. I think it's interesting to think about Michael Schumacher. Would he have gone on to have joined Ferrari? Would he have gone on to have had the career that he had were Senna to have survived that accident?
Yeah, I mean, maybe he wouldn't have gone to Ferrari. Maybe Senna would have been quite old, but you know, if he would have been the dominant driver, maybe he would have been the driver to sort of revive Ferrari in that way. I guess we should kind of touch on, like I say, 25 years ago today, Imola and the accident itself. I mean, it was an event of, it was kind of like it almost feels, when you look back now, like an ill-fated event all round. Like you mentioned at the top, Roland Ratzenberger had died the day before. Rubens Barrichello had a huge accident on the Friday, I think. And in the race itself, Pedro Lamy and JJ Leto had a massive crash on the start line. I think Leto had stalled and Lamy just smashed straight into the back of him, which brought out a safety car. And it was Senna, I remember I was writing this morning, I think it was only the third time ever that a safety car had been used in F1, and Senna didn't like it because he said, we drive too slow, the tyres get too cold. And the second lap after the safety car period itself, he had his accident. But when, you know, just like we were saying before, the whole event, I'm sure lots of people know this, but you know, Senna was carrying an Austrian flag in his Williams that day, which he planned to wave at after the race as a tribute to Ratzenberger. He had a bad feeling the whole race, and there's the famous quote from Sid Watkins, who was the F1's medical chief at the time. He said, "What else do you need to do? You've been world champion 3 times. You are obviously the quickest driver. Give it up and let's go fishing." And Senna's response was, I can't give up. I have to race. And you know, when that sort of, you know, when you hear these stories back, it sort of it almost adds to the myth of Senna itself. You know, the tragedy of the event and everything that surrounded it.
Yeah, the Sid Watkins quotes are really poignant, and if you actually look at pictures of Ayrton Senna on the grid that day, he looks really deep in thought. There's a lot going on in his mind, and you know, ironically, Ayrton was a driver who was really concerned about safety and especially the safety of other drivers as well. And I think, you know, we talk about this, we really should touch upon that and mention the impact on safety that his death had. If there was any kind of positive, you know, things have changed as a result.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, another quote I've got here is from Max Mosley, who was chief of the FIA for a long time. That Imola weekend was the catalyst for changes on the roads that has literally, without question, saved tens of thousands of lives. If you think of F1 in particular, there's only one driver in the quarter of a century since who's died as a result of injuries on track in F1, which is obviously Jules Bianchi. And like you say, given how much of a cheerleader, I guess, Senna was for improved safety, you know, for that to kind of go down as a consequence of him having passed away, I guess it is fitting, like you say, in a certain way that has come out of, you know, that tragedy.
Absolutely, and it is still sad to this day to think about what might have been for Ayrton Senna and the tragic loss of you know, his life, and also for Roland Ratzenberger too. Let's not forget about him. He was just starting out on his Formula One journey, and obviously he didn't have the exposure and the reputation that Ayrton Senna had. But you know, just also such a tragic loss as well, and something that I think was felt in an equal measure to Ayrton's death. We're running out of time now, so it's time to look ahead now to the next race in 2 weeks' time, which is in Spain, in Barcelona. Matt, what do you think will be the headlines that we'll be reading about in Barcelona?
I know I said this 2 weeks ago, but hopefully not a Mercedes 1-2, because I think they've got a nice record, that's good, but we really do need something else just to kind of spice the season up. I guess if we can take positivity from anything, obviously pre-season testing was in Barcelona, and Ferrari were, we think, you know, streets ahead of everyone there. So if they can put it all together, if the car's in the right place and the team can kind of just get through it without making too many mistakes, hopefully we'll see something a little bit different. It's also going to be, obviously it's the start of upgrade season for a lot of teams, so we might see, particularly in that midfield, we might see things moving around there, which should be pretty interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We can already see how competitive the midfield is. So there's a number of teams, probably Renault, the one that I guess will probably be looking more behind, over their shoulder at the teams trying to catch up with them than they are looking ahead to break into that top three. So it's going to be interesting to see if there's any change in that order once we start to see these upgrades come into effect. So that's all we've got time for today. So please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy the show. And please do leave us a review on iTunes if you get a moment. You can find us on Twitter at GPFans Global. And you can also head to gpfans.com, where you can find all the latest news in the build-up to the Spanish Grand Prix in 2 weeks' time. Thank you to Matt for keeping me company today, and thanks to you for listening. I have been Rob Watts, and I'll see you soon.
The GP Fans Podcast. Follow us on social media. Search GP Fans on Facebook and at GP Fans Global on Twitter and Instagram.